Throughout the 19th century, Jews and non-Jews were exploring the answer to the Jewish question. Now, what that Jewish question meant was different depending on who was asking the question. In places like Central and Western Europe, it may have had to do with questions of emancipation, about the rights of Jews in Western countries to have full equality, meaning even to the extent of being able to sit in government as legislators. However, the Jewish question had far more, shall we say, dark connotations as one looked towards Eastern Europe, where Jews were still regularly persecuted with overt anti-Semitism, with limits on what they could do economically, and with outright persecutions, particularly in the Pale of Settlement in Russia, where Jews were limited to where they could live, and so forth. And there you had millions of Jews living in abject poverty. And so this question of the Jewish question really dominated the landscape of Jewish thinking in the 19th century, certainly the interests of Jews during a time, as we've seen, where there was an increased amount of globalization in terms of information. And so really particularly from the 1840s, you see an increase in the familiarity of Jews in places like England or France with what's happening with Jews in other places around the world. And as a result, they become more keenly interested in their well-being, particularly during an expansion of what we might think of as kind of colonial holdings, where we know that Western European countries have increased influence on what's happening in other places around the world. And so Jews in those places will try and do their best to alleviate the plight of Jews in other places while struggling within their own locations to achieve full equality. We looked last time at the figure of Sir Moses Montefiore, a dominant figure in the 19th century who did a tremendous amount of good as a result of his own personal efforts to engage with world leaders. And he found a remarkable amount of success during the heyday of his activities. But we also saw that as he aged and as the world, shall we say, moved away from absolute monarchy and so on, his ability to influence events with such a kind of direct kind of engagement was declining. And as a result, Jews needed to look for new ways of answering these questions. What's amazing is that the figures that come to the fore during the middle of the 19th century, the later 19th century, are not necessarily religious figures or thinkers, but it's actually philanthropists. This is the age of a huge growth in Jewish philanthropic work, particularly coming from people who had done incredibly well in business or in banking. And so it's during these years that we think of the Rothschilds across Europe. We think of the Sassoons in Southeast Asia. And then we also think of Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who's going to be our primary focus today, because he really, out of all of them, was someone who was thinking out of the box, someone who was trying to be ambitious with attempts to resolve these questions beyond just supporting a local community where perhaps he was living, as you might think of the Sassoons or the works of the Rothschilds. Baron Hirsch was thinking globally, and his activities probably surpassed everyone's in terms of the financial investment that he put into trying to answer the Jewish question, not with, shall we say, a ideological or a conceptual answer to the Jewish question, but in answering the question by making a profound change to the conditions that Jews lived in. And so Baron Hirsch, to just take a step back and look at his life, was born in 1831. He was born into a banking family in Bavaria. His family had been a banking family associated with the rulers in places where they had lived for a couple of generations already. But he was sent to study in Brussels, which was quite exciting place to be during those years. And that's really where he starts to come into his own. And he develops very successful banking activities. But really, and this is where his story will skyrocket, will change, is when he wins the right to build the Ottoman Railway. It will cross all of the Ottoman Empire over to Vienna. It's a major, major project. And what's interesting about this is an age where governments don't have the capital to do major national infrastructure projects. They're still looking to private bankers, to private banks, to raise that capital. And so it's through that activity in the 19th century that you have some individuals who become fabulously wealthy, where in a sense they have the ability to control capital in a way that even governments aren't able to do so. And so he's very successful building a railway, and he decides to use his success not only to enjoy his own life. He has homes in many places, including eventually in London, but he begins to invest in trying to rehabilitate, or to, shall we say, to improve the lives of Jewish people, particularly in Eastern Europe. And so here he begins his activities with a very close association with a Paris-based Jewish charity, which is known as the Alliance Israelite Universelle. And this is a major organization that will set up schools across places where France has influence. And so you think of North Africa, into the Middle East, and also even into other places where their influence is welcomed. And so they set up schools everywhere, and he has a plan to establish these schools in Russia, particularly a secular education that he wants to provide to ensure that Jewish people there have access to education so they can then better themselves. Well, ultimately, there's a limit in success. The Russian government, which is deeply anti-Semitic, where you would have thought at first glance they would have welcomed this kind of investment, improving education among Jewish people. They would have been able to play more constructive and role within their society. They ultimately don't play ball, as it were. Perhaps they don't really want Jews to succeed, because what they really want perhaps is simply for the Jews to leave. And so ultimately there is this recognition that it's just not working. The idea that they can somehow, like Montefiore, convince a ruler to improve the plight of Russian Jewry, or that Jews in Western Europe can invest resources into Russian Jewry that will allow them to, shall we say, improve their lot, are proving unsuccessful. They're just not succeeding. And so there begins to be this pivot of thinking of saying, is there something else that can be done? And here you start having even some crazy ideas. There was a point in Baron Hirsch's life where he says that he thinks actually maybe Jews should just convert to Christianity, maybe particularly in places like Central Europe and Western Europe where he was. He said that way we'll get rid of anti-Semitism. He wasn't a particularly religious or devout Jewish person, though obviously quite clearly felt a fraternity with other Jewish people, if not in a religious sense, then perhaps in more of a kind of familial kind of way. But ultimately, what he proposes to do is to establish a pathway for Jewish emigration. And what he wants to do is to create essentially colonies where Jewish people from the Pale of Settlement can move to, and there they can become farmers and they can begin to better their lives. And you have a lot of interesting things happening here within this idea of farming, because this is a popular idea in the 18th, 19th century, which is that there is something, shall we say, morally redemptive in being a farmer, that people who work the land are somehow pulled out of the squalor, they're able to do something constructive with their hands, and through that they better themselves and become upstanding citizens. And this was this, shall we say, balanced with this idea that people who live in poverty are somehow morally corrupt. They're just petty trade. They live in dirt, right? This kind of idea of seeing them as living a bit as less than. And so it's this idea of, well, if we can't educate them in Eastern Europe, let's get them out and teach them to be farmers. And in that way, they will better themselves and they'll have a future for themselves. And it's interesting because it almost feels like only Hirsch could have come up with this idea, someone who had been a railroad magnate who would think about the idea of the movement of masses of people. Of course, the railways had transformed the movement of people. It allowed Hirsch himself to have a house in London and in Paris and in the Bavarian mountains where he could just, within hours, in a sense, within a day, travel from place to place. So this idea that you can move people was something that was familiar to him. But his idea, his ambition wasn't just to kind of find someplace else in Europe to go because, well, where else in Europe would they go? But was to say, well, how about we move them to the other part of the world? And his idea was to move Jews from Eastern Europe to Argentina. And here we find that he establishes an association, the Jewish Colonization Association, the JCA, which he establishes actually here in London in 1891 with millions of pounds, which is an astronomical number in those times, certainly today. I mean, really the greatest of Jewish philanthropists of his age. And he's going to enable the purchase of land in Argentina to help transport Jews from Eastern Europe to those colonies. He will help provide them with accommodation and with the materials they need in order to become farmers, as well as the training that they need. So this begins a whole process, which has a measure of success. There are some colonies that are established. There's the famous Moshe colony or Moise colony in Argentina. There's a couple that are established. There are several thousands of Jews that do move, but ultimately it doesn't really succeed. Becoming farmers is not really, the primary objective of Jews in Eastern Europe. Perhaps that idea of moving all the way to Argentina is a bit daunting. And so ultimately you find that some people are, shall we say, making their own decisions about where to go. And you'll have a huge influx of Jews into London during these years, maybe 150,000 Jews. And you'll have several million Jews that will migrate to America, obviously largely into New York City, but really all across the United States. And so there will then be funding set up to help those people to learn trades and to help them become established as well. But ultimately what Baron Hirsch represents is the significant role of philanthropists during the 19th century, of Jewish philanthropists to do significant things and really to almost take the leadership role in how Jews are going to navigate the challenges that they are facing. He also represents a person who's thinking globally, a railroad man, who's thinking around global movements, even of not just goods, but of people. And he's recognizing, and this is what's most significant, is that there doesn't seem to be a future for Jewish people in Eastern Europe. That's not going to be a place where Jews are going to be able to prosper. And that ultimately, if there is going to be a solution to this Jewish question, it's going to be through migration, right? It's going to be through their movement. Now, he ultimately wasn't right in terms of it being Argentina. It ends up being largely the United States and other places in Western Europe. But he recognizes that that's going to have to be the future, this pivot, in a sense, away from Europe. And that's something we're going to see, shall we say, taken even further when we look at our next significant figure of Theodor Herzl, really at the very end of the 19th century, and him starting to think quite radically around what could be the answer to this Jewish question. But Baron Hirsch is a hugely significant figure. In a sense, he's less remembered than some of these other key figures like Montefiore, Rothschild, even the Sassoons. But in a sense, he does the most ambitious project out of any of them, perhaps because it didn't, shall we say, succeed, is why he's not remembered as much, despite the fact that he invested more than anybody else. But what he did recognize was that there needed to be a radical solution to this continuing plight and problem. And so in that sense, he made a significant impact because he really started forcing other Jewish people to start saying, we need to look for other answers to this question. And so please join me in our next class as we look at Theodor Herzl, who of course is going to present a significant shift in the way that Jews are thinking about what their future could possibly look like. For those who are interested in learning more about Baron Hirsch and some of these other important philanthropists in the 19th century, there's been recently a number of really good works on these people. On Baron Hirsch, there's a wonderful recent work on his life by Professor Matthias Lehmann, definitely recommended. And on the Sassoon family, there's a book by Joseph Sassoon, not directly related to them, indirectly, called The Global Merchants, which is on the entire kind of rise and fall of the Sassoon family.